Montana Territory. Late autumn, 1883. The cottonwoods along the Gallatin River had already dropped their leaves when Samuel Bridger made a decision that would mark him as either a fool or a genius. No one in the valley had seen anything like what he was planning. And Cyrus Pendleton, the most respected timber builder between Bozeman and Virginia City, stood on the ridge that November morning, watching Samuel's crew cut into the hillside, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "That's a death trap dressed up as a cabin." Samuel didn't respond. He just kept swinging his pick into the frozen clay. What Samuel understood, and what the valley's expert builders missed, would only become clear when winter unleashed its full fury. Today, you're going to see why the worst idea in Montana Territory became the most copied cabin design within 2 years. You're going to understand what happens when ancient dugout wisdom meets frontier necessity, and why the numbers from that first winter humiliated every conventional method. But here's what I need from you. Hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because every week, I bring you one real frontier technique that saved lives when survival was the only measure of success. These aren't theories. These are solutions tested by blizzards, hunger, and isolation, the kind of pressure that separates working knowledge from deadly guesswork. Now, let's dig into what Samuel built and why it changed everything. The cabin scattered across the Gallatin Valley in 1883 followed a pattern as predictable as the seasons. Logs stacked horizontal, chinked with clay and moss, a stone fireplace on one end, a single door facing whichever direction seemed convenient when the builders started cutting timber. Every man who'd raised a cabin in the valley had done it the same way, because that's how it had been done in the Rockies, in the Appalachians, in every timber frontier from the Cumberland Gap to the Oregon Trail. And every winter, those cabins bled heat like open wounds. Samuel Bridger knew this because he'd spent his first Montana winter in one. He arrived in the valley in the spring of 1882 with his wife, Eliza, and their 2 young sons. He'd filed his claim, cut his timber, and raised the cabin by September. 16 feet by 20, notched corners, shake roof, clay chinking. Standard work. Solid work. The kind of cabin that would earn a nod from any passing trapper or surveyor. Then came December. The first storm dropped 18 inches of snow and pushed temperatures down to 15 below zero. Samuel burned through a week's worth of split wood in 3 days. The floor stayed so cold that frost crept up the inside walls by morning. His sons slept in layers of wool, pressed against their mother for warmth, while Samuel fed the fire every 2 hours through the night. When the wind came hard from the north, it found every gap in the chinking and turned the cabin into a drafty box that couldn't hold heat no matter how much fuel he burned. By February, he'd burned through 2 full cords more than he'd planned for. His hands were raw from splitting in the cold. Eliza had developed a cough that wouldn't quit, the kind that comes from sleeping in damp cold, breathing air that swings from smoky to freezing depending on where you stand in the room. Samuel wasn't alone. Every cabin in the valley fought the same fight. You could track a neighbor's desperation by watching their woodpile shrink, by counting the hours between smoke rising from their chimney. The families who'd stored less wood or built their cabins in exposed positions were burning furniture by March. One homesteader 2 miles south lost his cabin to a chimney fire after trying to force too much heat from greenwood, the kind of mistake that happens when you're cold enough to stop thinking straight. The valley solution was always the same. Cut more wood, build bigger fires, except that winter meant suffering and survival meant endurance. But Samuel had grown up different. His father had been a stonemason in Pennsylvania, a man who built root cellars and spring houses, structures that stayed cool in summer and never froze in winter. Samuel had spent his childhood in those stone chambers, watching his father shape thermal mass and explain how Earth itself could stabilize temperature if you understood its properties. Heat moves slow through stone and dirt, his father used to say, and that's the whole secret. That spring, after the snow melted and the valley thawed, Samuel walked the ridges around the property looking for something specific, a south-facing slope with good drainage, a hillside he could dig into without hitting bedrock or clay that would hold too much water. He found it in June, a gentle rise above the river bottomland, angled southeast, the soil a mix of sandy clay and gravel that would shed moisture but hold its shape when carved. He paced it off, drove stakes, and started planning something the valley had never seen. He was going to build a cabin half buried in the hillside, 3 walls backed by earth. One wall opened to the south with a door and 2 small windows. The floor would sit 4 feet below grade, with a stone foundation that extended into the slope to anchor the structure. The roof would be thick, layered sod over planks, insulated by the earth itself. It was a dugout cabin, the kind of structure Plains settlers had been using in treeless country for decades, modified with log framing and stone mass. It was practical. It was efficient. It was exactly the kind of shelter that would use the Earth's stable temperature to cut heating needs in half. And when Samuel started excavating the hillside in October, the valley decided he'd lost his mind. Samuel began by cutting into the slope at a depth of 6 feet, creating a rectangular chamber 16 feet wide and 20 feet deep. He carved the back wall and both side walls straight into the compacted clay, leaving the earth itself as the primary structure. The excavation angled slightly downward toward the front to ensure water would drain away from the interior, never pooling against the walls. Once the chamber was hollowed out, he laid a foundation of stacked fieldstone along the floor perimeter, raising the cabin's floor level 4 feet below the exterior grade, but 2 feet above the lowest point of the excavation. This created an air gap beneath the floorboards, a void that would stay dry and allow limited airflow without creating a wind channel that could rob heat. The exposed southern wall was framed with vertical logs, 14 inches in diameter, set deep into the stone foundation and extending 10 feet to support the roof beams. He left space for a door and 2 windows, both small enough to limit heat loss, but large enough to bring in southern light during the short winter days. Behind the log frame, he packed the carved earth walls with an additional layer of stacked stone, sandstone and limestone he'd hauled from a nearby creek bed. This added thermal mass would absorb heat from the interior and radiate it back slowly, stabilizing temperature swings. The roof was a critical piece. Samuel laid heavy pine beams across the span, then covered them with split planks, then a layer of birch bark for moisture protection, then 8 inches of soil, then a final layer of sod cut from a hillside. The result was a roof that weighed more than 3,000 pounds, a mass that wouldn't shift in wind, and would insulate the interior as effectively as 3 feet of log wall. For ventilation, he installed a stone chimney on the back wall, the flue extending up through the roof and past a ridgeline by 4 feet. The firebox sat low and deep, built with firebrick he'd traded for in Bozeman, designed to radiate heat forward into the room, while the stone mass behind absorbed and held warm for hours after the fire died. It was a design that minimized heat loss through every possible pathway. The earth-bermed walls eliminated wind infiltration. The stone mass stabilized interior temperature. The low profile reduced the volume of air that needed heating. The southern exposure captured passive solar gain during the day. The thick roof prevented convective losses through the ceiling, the single biggest weak point in a standard cabin. But to Cyrus Pendleton and the other experienced builders in the valley, it looked like a mistake waiting to collapse. Cyrus showed up in mid-October, while Samuel was setting the roof beams. He walked the perimeter, knocked on the log framing, peered into the excavation, and shook his head. "You're building a root cellar and calling it a home," he said. "That earth is going to hold moisture like a sponge. You'll have condensation dripping from the ceiling by December, mold growing on every surface by January. Your family will be coughing their lungs out before spring." Samuel pointed to the drainage channels he cut below the foundation, the air gap under the floor, the stone chimney designed to create a steady updraft that would pull moisture out of space. "The earth stays at 50 degrees year-round 6 feet down," he said. "It doesn't freeze, doesn't overheat. If I keep the interior warm and dry, the earth stabilizes everything." Cyrus wasn't convinced. "And when that roof settles, when those beams bow under the weight, when the spring melt saturates that hillside, and the whole thing slides down on top of you," he turned to the small crowd that had gathered, neighbors, curious homesteaders, a surveyor passing through. "This is what happens when a man forgets that a house needs to breathe, needs to stand above the ground where God intended. You're inviting the grave before your time." The criticism didn't stop with Cyrus. Over the next 2 weeks, as Samuel finished the chimney and hung the door, the valley's verdict spread. People called it the burrow, the mole hole, Bridger's folly. One woman from a neighboring claim told Eliza outright that raising children in a hole in the ground was an invitation to sickness and death, that no respectable family would live like animals. Even men who didn't know Cyrus, who had no stake in cabin-building tradition, found reasons to dismiss the design. It didn't look right. It didn't match the image of a frontier homestead, the proud log structure standing tall against the wilderness. Samuel's cabin looked like something you'd hide in, not something you'd build to stake a claim. By the time the first snow fell in mid-November, Samuel's family had moved in. They'd hauled their furniture down into the earth-sheltered space, hung their winter stores from the ceiling beams, and lit the first fire in the stone hearth. And the valley waited for the inevitable failure. The mockery started quietly, the way it does in small communities where everyone knows everyone else's business. A passing comment at the general store in Bozeman, a joke shared over a fence line, while two neighbors split wood. "Heard Bridger's living like a badger now," one man said. "Give it till January. He'll be digging his family out or digging graves, one or the other." Cyrus Pendleton didn't keep his opinion private. He'd built 18 cabins in the valley over 5 years, and his reputation as the region's most reliable timberman gave weight to his words. At a community gathering in late November, a pre-winter social held in the largest cabin near the river crossing, Cyrus stood near the fire and held court. "I've seen desperate men make desperate choices," he said. "But burying your family in a hillside takes a special kind of ignorance. That earth will cave in by spring when the melt hits. The moisture will rot those beams from the inside out, and if the structure holds, the damp air will kill his children before the cold does." Someone asked if Samuel had reinforced the walls, if there was stone or timber bracing the excavation. Cyrus shook his head. He's relying on packed clay and hope. That's not engineering. That's gambling with lives. Another voice chimed in, a trapper who'd spent winters in the high country. "A real man builds above ground. You face winter standing, not hiding in a hole." What kind of example is that for his sons? Eliza heard the talk. Women in the valley didn't confront men directly at public gatherings, but the judgment came through in other ways. Invitations stopped. Conversations ended when she approached. One neighbor, a woman named Judith who'd been friendly through the summer, told her plainly, "I can't risk my children playing near that place. If it collapses, I don't want them anywhere close." You understand? Eliza understood. She also understood that the cabin they were living in stayed warmer with less effort than any structure she'd inhabited since leaving Pennsylvania. The floor wasn't cold. The walls didn't weep with condensation. The air inside stayed breathable, even with the fire banked low overnight. But perception doesn't wait for proof. By early December, Samuel's family was functionally isolated. The few neighbors who still visited did so with a tone of pity, the kind of sympathy you extend to someone who's made a choice they'll regret but refuse to acknowledge. The children felt it too. Samuel's older son, 10-year-old Daniel, came home one afternoon and told his father that the Calloway boys, two brothers from a nearby claim, had said his family lived in a grave and that he smelled like dirt and roots. Samuel didn't respond with anger. He sat his son down, showed him a thermometer hanging near the door, 58 degrees inside while the air outside hovered near zero, and explained that people fear what they don't understand. "They'll see," he said. "Winter's just starting." But the weight of the valley's judgment pressed down nonetheless. Samuel stopped attending community gatherings. He kept to his claim, splitting the wood he needed, tending his small livestock, preparing for the deep cold he knew was coming. He didn't offend his design in public. He didn't argue with Cyrus or challenge the trapper's definition of manhood. He just waited, because Samuel knew something the valley didn't. He knew that January in Montana Territory was a crucible, a test that separated working knowledge from tradition. He knew that when the real cold arrived, the kind of cold that turns spit to ice before it hits the ground, the only thing that mattered was whether your family stayed warm and your wood supply lasted. And he knew, with the certainty that comes from understanding thermal mass and earth insulation, that his grave would outlast every conventional cabin in the valley. The blizzard that would prove him right was 3 weeks away. The first week of January 1884 opened cold but clear, the kind of hard, bright cold that homesteaders had learned to tolerate. Temperatures sat steady near 10 below zero, and the valley's families burned through their daily rations without panic. Smoke rose from every chimney at dawn, midday, and evening, a rhythm as predictable as breathing. Then the wind shifted. On January 9th, a gray wall of cloud moved down from the northwest, pushed by winds that stripped exposed skin in seconds. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours. By nightfall, the mercury in Samuel's outdoor thermometer had fallen below the lowest marking, -35 Fahrenheit. The wind howled to the cottonwoods along the river, bending saplings parallel to the ground and driving snow into every crack and crevice of the valley's structures. Inside the Pendleton cabin, Cyrus's own home, built to his exacting standards with 12-inch logs and double mortise corners. The family gathered near the fireplace and fed split pine into flames every 20 minutes. The heat radiated outward maybe 6 feet before dissipating into cold air that poured through the chinking gaps the wind had found. Cyrus's wife, Margaret, wrapped their youngest daughter in 2 wool blankets and kept her on a chair pulled close to the hearth. The far corners of the cabin hovered near freezing despite the roaring fire. By the second day, the wind hadn't relented. It came in sustained gusts that exceeded 50 miles per hour, a relentless pressure that drove snow through gaps no one had known existed. Cyrus burned through 4 days' worth of wood in 36 hours. He ventured out twice to haul more from his covered stack, and both times the cold bit through his wool coat and leather gloves, numbing his fingers before he could carry a full armload back inside. Other families fared worse. The Halstead cabin, 2 miles south, had been built quickly the previous summer with green wood that had shrunk as it dried. Opening gaps the family had packed with moss and mud. The blizzard wind found every weakness. By the 3rd day, they'd burned through their accessible wood supply and started breaking up furniture. Chairs first, then a table, then bed frames. Their fireplace, built with river stone and lime mortar, developed a crack that let smoke back into the room whenever the wind gusted hard. The Mitchells, a young couple on their first Montana winter, ran out of dry wood entirely. They'd store their split logs outside, uncovered, assuming they could access it as needed. The blizzard buried the pile under 4 feet of drifted snow and coated every piece with ice. When Jacob Mitchell finally dug through the stack, the wood was too wet to burn cleanly. It smoldered and filled their cabin with acrid smoke that drove them outside into the lethal cold until the air cleared. Across the valley, the pattern repeated. Families that had seemed well-prepared discovered that preparation meant nothing against sustained wind and 40 below temperatures. Chimneys that had worked fine in moderate cold now backdraft, when gusts created pressure differentials that overpowered the updraft. Floors transmitted cold from the frozen ground below. Walls that seemed solid in autumn became sieves under the blizzard's pressure. By the 4th day, January 12th, desperation had settled over the valley like the snow itself. Every family was burning wood faster than they planned, rationing heat, trying to calculate whether their supplies would outlast the storm. And then people started noticing something strange. Smoke rose from Samuel Bridger's chimney once in the morning, then nothing for hours, then a thin column in the evening. Not the continuous, desperate output of a family fighting to stay warm, but the measured rhythm of a household maintaining comfort. On the 5th day, Cyrus Pendleton pulled on every layer he owned and fought his way up the ridge to check on the Bridgers. He told himself he was being neighborly, making sure they hadn't frozen or suffocated in that hole in the ground. But the truth, the part he wouldn't admit even to himself, was that he needed to see what was happening in that earth-burned cabin. He found Samuel outside, splitting wood in the relative calm of the hillside's lee, working without gloves because the exertion kept his hands warm. "You all right?" Cyrus shouted over the wind. Samuel looked up, nodded, and gestured toward the cabin entrance. "Come inside. Warm up before you head back." Cyrus hesitated, then followed Samuel down the 3 stone steps to the heavy door set into the southern wall. Samuel pulled it open, and a wave of warm air rolled out into the frozen afternoon. Inside, the cabin was still, warm, almost comfortable. The children sat near the hearth, playing a game with carved wooden pieces. Eliza worked a small table, mending a shirt by the light from the south-facing window. The interior temperature, according to the thermometer Samuel had mounted near the door, read 58 degrees. The fire in the hearth had burned down to coals. Cyrus stood just inside the door, snow melting off his coat, staring at a reality that didn't match anything he'd been taught about heating a home in Montana winter. "How long since you fed that fire?" he asked. Samuel glanced at the hearth. 3 hours, maybe 4. I'll add wood after supper. We go through about 1 armload every 8 hours when it's this cold. Cyrus did the math in his head. His own cabin was consuming an armload every 90 minutes, and the interior still felt cold enough to see your breath in the corners. "That's not possible," he said. Samuel walked to the back wall, placed his palm flat against the stone behind the firebox. "Still warm," he said. "This mass holds heat for hours. The earth around us stays at 50 degrees year-round. We're not fighting to heat the space. We're just keeping it a few degrees above what the ground provides naturally." Cyrus moved closer to the hearth, felt the radiant warmth still emanating from the stone, looked up at the ceiling where no condensation dripped, no moisture beaded. The air smelled clean. Wood smoke, yes, but not the choking haze that filled his own cabin when he burned hard. "And you're not cold at night." "Floor stays warm," Eliza said from the table. "No drafts. The boys sleep straight through." Cyrus stayed for 10 minutes, warming his hands, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he knew about cabin construction. Then he thanked Samuel, pushed back out into the blizzard, and made his way down the ridge to his own home, where his family huddled near a fire that consumed like hunger and still left the room half frozen. The blizzard continued for 2 more days, and when it finally broke on January 15th, the valley emerged into bitter stillness to count the cost. The Halsteads had burned their last piece of furniture. The Mitchells had suffered frostbite. 3 families had chimneys that needed repair before they could safely burn fires again. Every household in the valley had depleted their wood stores by at least 1/3, some by half. Samuel Bridger's woodpile looked almost untouched. And Cyrus Pendleton, the most respected builder in Montana Territory, couldn't stop thinking about what he felt when he placed his hand against that warm stone wall. Word spread fast in the cold that followed the blizzard. By the 3rd week of January, a dozen men had made the walk up to Samuel's cabin, ostensibly to check on the family, but really to see for themselves what Cyrus had described. They came skeptical and left quiet, the kind of silence that follows when evidence contradicts belief so completely that argument becomes impossible. Daniel Farrow, a surveyor who kept meticulous weather records for the territorial office, brought his instruments. He measured the interior temperature of Samuel's cabin at 3 different times over 2 days: 56 degrees at dawn before the fire was rebuilt, 61 degrees at midday with moderate sun through the south windows, 58 degrees at evening after the fire had burned down to coals again. Outside temperatures during the same period ranged from -12 to +8 degrees Fahrenheit. Farrow then visited the Pendleton cabin and took comparative readings. With a fire burning continuously, Cyrus's interior temperature fluctuated between 48 and 64 degrees, depending on proximity to the hearth. The corners of the room never rose above 42 degrees. The floor near the door stayed cold enough to stiffen leather. The difference wasn't subtle. Samuel's earth-burned cabin maintained a stable 58 degrees, with 1 fire cycle every 8 hours. Cyrus's conventional cabin required continuous burning to achieve an average temperature 10 degrees colder, with wild variations depending on location within the room. But temperature stability was only part of the story. The real shock came when people started comparing with consumption. Samuel had stacked 4 cords of split pine and fir in a covered shed adjacent to his cabin entrance in October. By late January, after the worst cold the valley had seen in 5 years, he'd burned through 1 1/4 cords. At his current rate, his supply would last well into April, past the point when spring temperatures would reduce heating needs to occasional evening fires. Cyrus, by contrast, had stored 6 cords for his family of 5. He'd burned through 2 3/4 cords by the same January date, and he was rationing carefully, letting the fire die overnight and enduring cold mornings to stretch his supply. His neighbors faced similar or worse situations. The Halsteads, who'd started with 3 cords, were down a half a cord and facing the real possibility of running out before March. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Samuel's cabin used roughly 60% less wood than a conventional structure of equivalent size, while maintaining superior comfort and temperature stability. Jacob Mitchell, the young homesteader who'd nearly frozen when it got too wet, asked the question everyone was thinking. How is the floor warm? Every cabin I've ever been in, the floor is the coldest part. You can have a fire hot enough to blister paint, and your feet still freeze. Samuel walked him through it. 4 feet of earth below the floor level. Stone foundation extending into the hillside. The ground 6 feet down never freezes. It stays around 50 degrees winter and summer. That warmth conducts up through the stone into the floorboards. I'm not fighting frozen ground, pulling heat down. I'm standing on a foundation that's already halfway to comfortable. He explained the roof next. 8 inches of soil and sod above the planks. That's insulation and thermal mass combined. Heat rises, but it moves slow through that much earth. What I lose through the roof in a day is less than what a standard cabin loses through the ceiling in an hour. Then he addressed the elephant in the conversation. The thing every visitor had been too polite or too proud to ask directly. You all thought moisture would be the problem. Condensation, mold, rot. But look around. Feel the walls. The air is dry because the stone and earth absorb moisture during the day when we're cooking and breathing, then release it slowly when the fire's burning and creating updraft through the chimney. The system balances itself. Pharaoh, the surveyor, put his hand against the back wall where the stone mass backed the firebox. It was warm to the touch hours after the fire had been fed. Thermal mass, he said. I've read about this in engineering journals. The Romans used it in their bathhouses, but I've never seen it applied to a frontier cabin. My father was a stonemason, Samuel said. He built root cellars that stayed at 55 degrees year-round with no fire, no ice. Same principle. Earth and stone stabilize temperature because they change temperature slowly. You can fight winter, or you can use the ground itself as a buffer. I chose the buffer. Over the next 2 weeks, as the valley recovered from the blizzard and temperatures moderated into the teens and 20s, more families visited. They measured, asked questions, walked the perimeter of the excavation checking for cracks or settling. They found none. The structure was sound, the air was clean, and the family living inside was healthier and more comfortable than any household in the valley. The numbers didn't lie. Samuel's death trap had outperformed every conventional cabin in the Gallatin Valley by a margin, so wide it couldn't be dismissed as luck or anomaly. 58 degrees on one fire cycle every 8 hours. 60% reduction in wood consumption. Stable humidity. No backdrafting. No frozen floors. No condensation. Cyrus Pendleton, to his credit, was the first to say it out loud. He came back to Samuel's cabin in early February, this time without pretense, and stood in the center of the room for a long moment before speaking. I was wrong, he said. I built cabins for 5 years, and every one of them loses heat, like a sieve compared to this. I don't know why I didn't see it. He looked at Samuel. The earth does what I thought only thick timber could do. You weren't being reckless. You were being smarter than the rest of us. Samuel didn't gloat. He just nodded and offered Cyrus a seat near the fire, because the story wasn't about being right. It was about survival. And in the end, winter doesn't care about pride or tradition. It only cares about who stays warm and who doesn't. Spring came late to the Gallatin Valley in 1884. The snow didn't fully melt until mid-April, and the ground stayed frozen hard enough to wring under a shovel until May. But by the time the cottonwoods leafed out and the river ran clear, something fundamental had shifted in how the valley's homesteaders thought about shelter. Cyrus Pendleton was the first to act on what he'd learned. In early March, while snow still covered the ground, he walked his own property looking for a south-facing slope. He found one on the northern edge of his claim, a gentle rise that caught morning sun and shed water naturally toward a seasonal creek. He spent 2 weeks that spring excavating a chamber similar to Samuel's design, though he modified it with his own timber framing expertise, adding internal bracing and a more elaborate roof structure. By the time he moved his family into the new cabin that October, he'd become an advocate for earth berm construction. I spent 5 years building the wrong way, he told anyone who'd listen. I was so focused on what a cabin should look like that I never stopped to think about what it should do. Samuel understood function. I was chasing form. The Mitchells were next. Jacob Mitchell had come closer to losing his family than he cared to admit during the January blizzard, and the memory of that wet wood and choking smoke stayed with him through the spring. He filed for an additional 40 acres that included a hillside with good drainage, and by late summer, he'd carved out his own version of Samuel's design, smaller, simpler, but built on the same principles of thermal mass and earth insulation. By the winter of 1884 to 85, for families in the immediate valley had earth-berm cabins. By the winter of 1885 to 86, that number had grown to 11, spread across a 40-mile radius. The designs varied. Some builders used more stone. Others relied more heavily on log framing. A few experimented with deeper excavations or alternative roof structures. But the core principle remained constant. Use the Earth's stable temperature as a foundation. Minimize exposed surfaces. Maximize thermal mass. The technique spread to the kind of organic transmission that defines frontier adaptation. A trapper passing through the valley stopped at Samuel's cabin, saw the design, and described it to homesteaders in the Boulder River drainage. A family moving west from Minnesota heard about the earth-berm cabins from a supplier in Bozeman and built their own version on a claim near Livingston. A territorial surveyor included a sketch and description in his annual report, and that drawing made its way into the hands of settlers across Montana and Wyoming. What Samuel had built wasn't entirely new. Dugout cabins had been used on the plains for decades, and cultures around the world had been building earth-sheltered structures for thousands of years. But Samuel's specific application, combining dugout principles with log framing, stone mass, and careful attention to drainage and ventilation, created a hybrid design that worked exceptionally well in the northern Rockies' extreme climate. The social shift was perhaps more significant than the technical adoption. By the fall of 1885, the valley's definition of what constituted a real cabin had expanded. The shame and mockery that had surrounded Samuel's decision in 1883 had transformed into respect and, in some cases, envy. Men who called his design a death trap now asked detailed questions about excavation angles and stone placement. Women who'd pitted Eliza for raising children in a hole now commented on how warm and dry her home felt compared to their own drafty structures. Samuel never claimed credit for inventing the technique. When people asked him where he'd learned to build that way, he always mentioned his father, the stonemason, and the root sellers of Pennsylvania. He talked about dugouts on the plains, about sod houses in Nebraska, about the way indigenous peoples across the continent had been using earth as insulation for generations before Europeans arrived. I didn't invent anything, he'd say. I just paid attention to what worked and stopped caring about what it looked like. That humility might have been genuine, or it might have been pragmatic, a way of deflecting the resentment that sometimes follows when one man's success highlights another man's mistakes. Either way, it worked. Samuel remained a respected member of the community, and his cabin became a teaching tool rather than a point of controversy. The winter of 1886 to 87 brought another severe cold snap, though not as prolonged or intense as the blizzard of 1884. But this time, the valley was better prepared. The families living in earth-berm cabins weathered the cold with minimal strain. The families still in conventional structures had learned to store more wood, to improve their chinking, to manage their fires more efficiently. The collective knowledge of the community had improved, and fewer people suffered as a result. Samuel's oldest son, Daniel, the boy who'd been mocked for living in a grave, grew up to become a builder himself. He spent his adult life designing and constructing earth-sheltered homes across Montana and Idaho, always crediting his father's willingness to ignore convention in favor of evidence. He lived until 1943, long enough to see modern engineers rediscover the principles of passive solar design and thermal mass that his father had applied in a Montana hillside 60 years earlier. The original cabin still stood in 1920, though Samuel and Eliza had long since moved to a larger home in Bozeman. A homesteader passing through the valley that year took a photograph of the structure. You can still find that image in the Montana Historical Society archives if you know where to look. The logs had weathered to silver gray, the sod roof had regrown with native grasses, and the southern walls showed the wear of nearly 4 decades of use. But the structure itself remained sound, the excavation stable, the stone foundation intact. It had outlasted most of the conventional cabins built during the same period. Because in the end, that's what frontier wisdom comes down to, not what looks impressive, not what matches tradition, but what works when survival is the only metric that matters. Samuel Bridger understood that the earth beneath his feet held more stability than the opinions of men who'd never questioned why they built the way they did. He understood that ancient techniques survived because they solved real problems, and that innovation often means recognizing old solutions that arrogance had dismissed. The valley learned that lesson the hard way, through frozen mornings and depleted woodpiles and one long blizzard that separated working knowledge from comfortable assumptions. And once learned, that lesson spread, quietly, practically, one earthworm cabin at a time, until the worst idea in Montana territory became common sense. So here's my question for you. Which part of Samuel's solution would you apply to your home today? Would it be the thermal mass? The earth insulation? The careful attention to passive solar orientation? Maybe the simple recognition that sometimes the most effective answer is the one that contradicts what everyone else is doing? Drop a comment below and tell me. And while you're at it, let me know where you're watching from and what the coldest winter you've ever faced felt like. Because these stories, these frontier solutions that save lives when conditions turn lethal, they're not just history. They're working knowledge that we spent the last century forgetting. If this kind of content speaks to you, hit that subscribe button. Every week I bring you one real technique from the frontier, the kind of practical wisdom that emerges when people have to solve problems with their hands, their minds, and whatever materials the land provides. No theory, no speculation, just solutions tested by the worst weather, the longest winters, and the kind of pressure that reveals what actually works. Thanks for watching. Stay warm, stay smart, and remember, sometimes the best way forward is to dig down and let the earth do the work.